a giant ISIS bomb in the middle of Baghdad just went off. It's grotesque. It's endless. I'm going to tell you what went wrong here. There are many obvious things. You know what the death toll was? 250. We get used to the massacres in Iraq. We got used to the carnage that we open up a Pandora's box over there, and some say over 1 million civilians have died since we invaded Iraq. But don't get used to that number. 250 people dead in one terrorist bombing is horrific. I don't care what country it's in. Yes, the fact that Iraq is war-torn doesn't mean you should have less sympathy for it. It means you should have more sympathy for it. Associated Press explains the staggering figure, one of the worst bombings in 13 years of war in Iraq, has cast a pall on the Muslim holiday of Eid al-Fitr, which marks the end of the holy month of Ramadan and which begins Wednesday in Iraq. So, look, this partly goes to the point that I made the other day on the bombings and shootings inside of Istanbul's airport. Well, if the Quran tells you that you're not supposed to fight during Ramadan, and ISIS fights during Ramadan, does that make them good Muslims or bad Muslims? Look, I'm not an authority on it. I left the religion. I left all religions because I think they're nonsense. They're not remotely true. They have good, positive things like help the poor, and they have disastrous things like kill everyone who doesn't agree with you. But they also say don't do bombings, and not bombings, they didn't have bombs back then, but don't do violence, don't do warfare during Ramadan, but ISIS does it. So I want to ask everybody involved here, if you're in the Muslim world, what do you think of ISIS? If they clearly violate the strictures of the Quran, the literal reading of the Quran, the very, very clear explanation in the Quran that you should not do this, does that make them good Muslims or bad Muslims? Seems to make them bad Muslims. So maybe you shouldn't follow them. Maybe, and by the way, of course, the overwhelming majority of Muslims don't need to be lectured on that. They know that they're the ones being killed in their bombings. But for anyone thinking of joining ISIS, it's not just that they're monstrous, it's also that they don't actually follow the Quran. If they're trying to trick you by telling you that they follow the Quran, well, now you have overwhelming evidence that that is not the case, and they're complete goddamn liars. And of course, for those here in the West who think, well, this is what Islam says. Well, is it? I mean, the Quran says don't do this in Ramadan. Again, I'm not here to defend Islam. I left it. I think it's totally hypocritical and most importantly, 100% incorrect. But it also says don't do this, and they did it anyway. So are we supposed to hate the good Muslims or the bad Muslims? The non-practicing Muslims or the practicing Muslims? Or perhaps we could look at what really happened. So, yes, the violence is justified by some parts of Islam. No question about that. You want to fight that strain of Islam, that narrow range of culture that has gone wrong? I'm not going to join you. I'm going to lead that effort. I do lead that effort every day on this show. We fight against that culture. We fight against fundamentalism. We fight against radicals. We fight against violence. Now, secondly, was there bombings every day in Iraq before we invaded? Was there 250 people killed left and right? No, don't blame America, don't blame America. Okay, well, you want to choose to be ignorant? That's the decision you're making? No, I don't see it, I don't see our invasion. No, that had no factor. It's just people I don't like that did it, okay? Yeah, but there was no ISIS before we invaded Iraq. That doesn't absolve ISIS. I just told you I can't stand ISIS. They're murderous, barbaric people. But it also means our actions have consequences. We opened up that Pandora's box, and ISIS is one of the things that flew out. But there's more to it. You know how we bragged about the surge? John McCain still running his mouth about the goddamn surge in Iraq. Oh, yeah, so we were so smart. You know, Obama withdrew the troops, but if he just kept on going with the surge that George Bush did, where we put in more weapons and more money into Iraq and quieted things down. You know what happened in the surge? They went to the Sunnis and paid them and weaponized them not to fight us. Who has those weapons and money now? Oh, right, ISIS. Oops. One more thing. And this the U.S. was right about. The U.S. warned the people like Nouri al-Maliki, the former prime minister of Iraq. He said, we know you're Shiite. We know you don't like the Sunnis. We know you're likely to run roughshod over them, but don't do it. It's a bad idea. It'll lead to further civil war. Don't do it. And that's the thing the U.S. was right about. And Maliki was like, now I'm in charge. What did you think was going to happen, dummy Americans? I'm a Shiite. I hate the Sunnis. I'm going to go and oppress the Sunnis. I'm going to kill the Sunnis. I'm not going to give any money to the Sunnis, even though they're theoretically part of the Iraqi government. And guess what happened with the Sunnis? When you did that, they've turned into ISIS. Well played, Maliki. Well, that was a super smart move on your part. And now there's bombings that are ripping Baghdad apart. Because it turns out you should have been decent to the other side. But then go back to, again, Cheney and Rumsfeld and Bush, who said, they'll throw roses at our feet. They'll throw roses at our feet. This will cost us almost nothing. And yes, of course the Shiites and Sunnis can live together in peace. Of course, it'll be easy. Does it look easy? Instead, we unleashed hell upon Iraq and upon the rest of us. And then George Bush had the temerity to land on an aircraft carrier with a sign behind him, mission accomplished. So those are your range of factors that led to those poor people being killed today. If you don't want to acknowledge those factors, you're an ignorant person. Go ahead and wallow in your ignorance. The reality is all those things are relevant, and that's what's led to this. You might want to understand that so we can prevent this from happening in the future.